using e-cigarettes to transition away from smoking, that they mainly relied on Juul in comparison to like other e-cigarette companies. Your question?
When there are other proven drugs out there on the market that specifically help people reduce their cigarette addiction, why would we turn to Juul, which has been proven to have adverse health risks?
Juul is more effective than these alternatives. Like in a study where they compared it against things like patches and nicotine gum and all these other alternatives, they found that e-cigarettes, specifically Juul, was nearly twice as effective. I believe it was like 20% to like 10%, something around those numbers. So it's just a lot more effective. So it's more likely that there'll be less harmful health impacts by using these e-cigarettes. But another reason why Juul is really important is that Juul is one of the kind of better e-cigarette companies, in that they've always had strong regulations. They always kept nicotine levels to below 5%, for example. So on the impact level, by banning Juuls and getting rid of one of the most effective ways to decrease reliance on smoking and nicotine consumption in general is smoking deaths, because we see that 520,000 Americans die annually prematurely from smoking-related causes. And in fact, another study found that replacement of most cigarette use by e-cigarette use over a 10-year period yields up to 6.6 million fewer premature deaths, with 86.7 million fewer years of life lost. So essentially, Juuls were a way to help save lives by, again, preventing people from relying on more serious forms of nicotine consumption and ultimately helping people quit consumption like completely. That is how Juuls were able to help people transition away from not only smoking, but just entirely nicotine consumption overall. Our second contention is that by banning Juul, this exposes people to worse alternatives, because we see that Juul is a necessary alternative to cigarettes, because otherwise this means that people are simply, again, going to turn back to cigarettes, which are worse. We see that teens experiment with smoking, like regardless of whether it's an e-cigarette or a normal cigarette. 90% of regular cigarette smokers began before the age of 18. Restricting these options by banning Juul, again, a highly regulated form of e-cigarettes, only means they turn back to other alternatives, which are either tobacco or worse e-cigarette forms. We said that smoking cigarettes is specifically worse for health. Studies find that they're more addictive. Because levels of nicotine are kept very low in Juul products, a study found that tobacco cigarettes tend to be much more addictive, particularly for use, than, again, e-cigarettes. This means they also have higher impacts on health. A study found that smokers who switch to vaping have experienced improved lung capacity and frequent asthma events. So even if someone is still consuming nicotine, it's better that they do it with Juul rather than with smoking. But thirdly, is for people who only rely on e-cigarettes, this ban only leads to them relying on worse forms of e-cigarettes. What we see is that Juul, again, is not the only company. However, we argue that it is the best e-cigarette company out there because in comparison, what teens are turning to is another more unregulated type of e-cigarette called a puff bar. In fact, the use of puff bar by use went up by 1,000% in just the past few years. We see that as a result, this means that banning Juul products isn't really helping, because the Wall Street Journal found that the puff bar has overtaken Juul as the favorite e-cigarette for teens, which means teens are just turning to a different form of e-cigarette because Juul is banned. But we see that this is now worse. Yes, your question.
Do you think that Juul's marketing campaign specifically directed towards teens has been worse than many of these other alternatives?
We would argue that the regulations are actually pretty sufficient because, in fact, the FDA, one of the main market appeals of Juul was that they had different flavors, but the FDA recently banned any other e-cigarette flavors other than tobacco and menthol. So that kind of decreased the appeal for youth, which means that they were effectively being regulated against before this ban on Juul products entirely. Instead, they were properly regulated. And on the other hand, puff bars highly unregulated. They don't concern themselves with keeping nicotine levels to under 5%. And not only is puff bar unregulated, but it's also just generally more unhealthy. Again, it requires people to inhale more deeply, meaning they get higher levels of nicotine in their lungs, which means it's just another more unhealthy and more unsafe form. And again, even if they bring up the issue of the marketing campaign, we see that teens, because of this ban, teens are turning to puff bars. Again, usage has gone up 1,000%, which means on net, we're going to see worse impacts for health because we're going to see both more adults relying on more adults and teens relying on cigarettes, as well as more unhealthy forms of e-cigarettes. So because these Juul products are so important to helping people decrease their nicotine consumption, transition away from smoking, and avoid more harmful forms of nicotine consumption, I strongly urge a vote for the affirmation.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm Hari Harviswanathan. I will be the first speaker for the opposition. And I will begin when everyone is ready.
Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So a quick off-time roadmap. In this speech, I'll briefly go over the opposition's sole contention and then use that contention to rebut both of the government's contentions. So that being said, my time will begin now. So first, I just want to say I agree with the framework by the government, and I think this debate should be about net harms versus net good. But I want to bring up a brief equity issue about how this round is not supposed to be focused on statistics, and the NPDL highly frowns upon the use of cited evidence, and our opponent used cited evidence repeatedly, and much of their case came from verified studies, which obviously we have no way to verify the details of. Therefore, those studies and detailed statistics should be valued as the same weight as a general claim that's not cited. So with that being said, let's get into the opposition's sole contention, the FDA's statement about marketing. The Juul ban is not just about the specific effects of banning Juul. It's part of a larger statement to crack down on the nicotine epidemic, specifically about marketing towards teens and vulnerable populations. It's not about the specific arguments about Juul's effects. It's the message that the FDA and the US government send, and the message that they won't stand for companies marketing life-threatening products towards teenagers. Let's take a step back to consider how truly awful Juul has been. E-cigarettes, a potential life-threatening device that ruins families on a daily basis, is being proactively marketed towards children just for profit by a company. This is almost as bad as companies willingly going out of their way to inflict harm against children just for profit. Banning Juul, even though this action may have some negative effects, as all policies do, it serves as an overall good. Because right now, Juul looks to be a step closer to bankruptcy filing, as it tries to explore options to keep it afloat while combating the FDA. So this is actually good because it shows a statement that the FDA has zero tolerance for marketing towards children and vulnerable populations. And it discourages not only Juul, but all other drug companies in the future from promoting their product to children. And this will significantly reduce the impact of vaping over time. Even if we can't see it in just the 2 or 3 months after this legislation has been passed, we can see it in the decades that will come in the future when the FDA sends a message that they have zero tolerance for any sort of marketing of life-threatening products to children. So now, onto that, I want to talk about why Juul has actually been so bad to market against children. So Juul has actually deployed a sophisticated program paying schools as much as $10,000 each to let company representatives deliver its message directly to children. In multiple presentations, without teachers' or parents' consent, company representatives Juul showed kids how to use a Juul e-cigarette. Other evidence showed that Juul Labs targeted preteen kids through summer camps and out-of-school programs. They have funneled millions of dollars into this marketing campaign and have tried to keep it largely in secret. So Juul's marketing has been far from good. So now I'll use this claim about the FDA statement against marketing of Juul to combat the government's contentions. So the first point is that it helps people quit smoking. So I have a couple different responses to this. Number one, there are already better drugs on the market to combat smoking. For example, 2 drugs that are approved by the FDA are bupropion and varenicline. So both of them have little to no side effects as adverse as vaping, and they've been proven to help people quit smoking, decrease cravings, and decrease other nicotine withdrawal symptoms. So these are far safer options to go to than vaping. Because a year after quitting tobacco, most vapers were still using e-cigarettes, while fewer than 1 in 10 smokers actually quit with the help of nicotine replacement therapy. So even though they might get off smoking, which is what our opponent's statistics said, yes, they stopped smoking, but they're still hooked on this nicotine addiction from Juul and other vape products. And many doctors even recommend vaping should only be used as a last line of resort to help quit smoking. So it's not even a good solution because it's not confirmed by experts. And also, the main problem with this argument is that new people are constantly getting on Juul every day because of their egregious marketing campaign. So even though the opponent says they're helping people quit smoking, they're also influencing millions of teens to get on smoking. So we're telling people to stop smoking by vaping. And then we're also at the same time getting new kids to start vaping. So when we talk about net harms versus net good, this is an egregious net harm for everyone because more people are vaping and people aren't even quitting smoking because it's not effective. So this entire contention just falls because one, vaping is not confirmed to help people tell people quit smoking. And also there are better drugs and new people are getting on smoking. Now their contention too is that banning Juul exposes people to worse alternatives. So I also have some responses to this. Number one, Juul is not even better than alternatives. Juuls have a significantly higher amount of nicotine per puff compared to other types of e-cigarettes and cigarettes, and is actually designed to increase the rate of nicotine delivery to make people addicted as quickly as possible. And Juul has been found repeatedly that they don't list the true nicotine content. They don't list the true nicotine content on their products. And this also brings me back into marketing. So the opposition said that banning Juul exposes people to worse alternatives, but the whole problem with Juul is its marketing campaign designed specifically for teens. So if we ban Juul, Juul will no longer have this egregious multi-million-dollar marketing campaign, and therefore kids will be less likely to start vaping in the future. So as we're talking about, this is a statement. This is meant, banning Juul is meant to stop the vaping epidemic over decades. It's not going to be a short-term thing. It's going to be a long-term uphill battle. But by banning Juul and stopping its marketing campaign, we're essentially stopping new kids from starting to vape because these other smaller companies, they won't have the millions of dollars to spend on marketing campaigns. So kids won't hear about vaping. And at the end of the day, kids won't start vaping. Because also, the more products there are in the market, the more opportunities there are for kids to get addicted. So again, with this Juul's marketing, it only encourages more people to get addicted. So with that, I've laid out my contention and I've rebutted both of the opponents' contention 1 and contention 2. And I'll just briefly go over what I've said in the speech. So against their contention 1, helping people quitting smoking, number 1, there are better drugs on the market that are more safe, like the ones I cited. Also, the opponent is just repeating studies after studies of why Juul does help quit smoking, but this is not confirmed by experts. And also, new people are constantly, if we throw all the studies aside and just use pure logic, Juul is getting millions of kids addicted to vaping every year. So that small benefit of getting people to stop smoking, when you compare that with the huge negative impact of getting millions of kids to start vaping, net harm versus net good, this is ultimately a net harm, and you should vote for the opposition. So that point is dropped. Contention 2, that it exposes people to worse alternatives. Our alternatives might not even be better than Juul, as I've said, because Juul has more nicotine per puff. And 2, again, throw all the studies aside, Juul's marketing campaign is what causes this nicotine epidemic. If we get rid of Juul's marketing campaign and send a statement that the FDA has zero tolerance for nicotine marketing towards children, then for the decades to come, for our children and their children, we make sure that this nicotine epidemic will stop and that people won't be vaping in the future at all. So overall, some impacts. In our world, when you ban Juul, you send a statement to stop marketing. So kids will not get addicted to nicotine in the future. But if we bring back Juul, this nicotine epidemic will still continue to hurt people for generations to come. So for these reasons, negate. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kira Chatwin, and I'll be the second speaker for the affirmative in today's debate. I will first be going over our 2 contentions, and then I will go over side negations contentions. Okay. 8 minutes. Is anybody not ready? And in case sometimes my NSDA is a little weird and it doesn't give me the sounds when people raise their hands. So if I just miss you, feel free to call out POI. Okay. 8 minutes. Is anybody not ready? My time will begin now. This round fundamentally isn't a question of whether people will turn to smoking or Juul or anything else or not. Unfortunately, that is inevitable because teens tend to be pretty experimental in terms of what they're trying out, and the culture around that is simply that people are going to be experimenting with things such as drugs. Instead, this round is a question of what the best thing, the best alternative to provide to them is in order to resolve things such as smoking, which is a current epidemic both sides have identified. Let's go to our first contention, which is that about quitting smoking. The overview to this contention is that we see that Juul is critical to decreasing smoking harms, which is necessary to preserving health of all of the people of the US. Remember, we tell you that Juul, and particularly e-cigarettes in general, are necessary in order to provide a open alternative for people to access to transition away from things such as smoking, which is critical because this is necessary to save lives. Now, our opponents essentially concede that smoking is probably going to be a whole lot worse than e-cigarettes. The only thing they write in response is essentially that there are already better drugs with less side effects. However, they've essentially identified two drugs that, first of all, have not been commercialized in any aspect, which means that they're probably prescription drugs offered at very high prices from things such as doctors. Which the implication of this is twofold. First is that these drugs tend to be very, very inaccessible because what happens is these drugs are essentially like they've been tested in a clinic. They aren't implemented wide scale, which means that you essentially have to get access to them in order to be able to use them to get off an addiction, for example. Which means that on net, we see that people are going to be having to pay a lot of money in order to be able to afford this. But the second impact of this is that there's a stigma around it. Because now going to the doctor to admit essentially you have a smoking addiction in order to get access to these these FDA approved drugs is now going to be through a clear process. Like there is no way that people who are on a smoking addiction, for example, would go to the doctor intending to do that. We tell you that Juul, for example, and other smoking alternatives are critical alternatives to smoking because they don't have this stigma. They allow people to continue to feel as though they have control over the process, that they are getting themselves off of it. We tell you that the stigma around people essentially turning themselves in order to get prescription medicine is what prevents a whole lot of people from even attempting to get off of smoking in the first place, which is why we say that this is critical that we have an alternative such as e-cigarettes. Furthermore, they tell you that it's not going to work because people are still hooked on nicotine, not just cigarettes. But we tell you that this is essentially true of all other drugs. The only way that you replace an addictive drug, such as smoking, is by introducing a somewhat less addictive drug. We'd argue that the drugs that they are producing are probably going to produce the same side effects in terms of the long-term addictions. But again, we tell you that e-cigarettes have historically been shown. Is that a POI?
Yeah.
Yeah? Do you want to ask?
Yeah. So, okay, I agree with you. It might cause people to go from smoking to vaping, but is one person going from smoking to vaping better than 10 new people getting addicted because of Juul's egregious marketing campaign?
Well, Juul's egregious marketing campaign has been shut down already, so I'd argue that it's an issue resolved. Okay, let's continue on. But we tell you that e-cigarettes are critical to getting people away from smoking in an accessible way that people will actually take advantage of, which is why we see that in our impact section, we distinctly identify that this is going to save millions and millions of lives because people are switching over to e-cigarettes. This is a huge impact. We are able to support people shifting away in a manner that is actually going to be very, very accessible to the public, which is going to mean that we see that there are less deaths due to smoking and on net, less health impacts. Now, let's go to our second contention, which is that all the alternatives are worse. The overview here is simply that any alternative Juul is a whole lot worse than Juul, and there's a couple of reasons for that. We tell you that all the other drugs all the other e-cigarette brands, for example, are much worse in terms of nicotine addiction than Juul. They tell you that there's higher nicotine per puff, but we tell you that there are distinct regulations on Juul that it caps its nicotine percentage that it's putting into these that is putting into the e-cigarettes to ensure that it complies with regulations. Juul is heavily regulated in contention to what my opponents say. On the other hand, we tell you that Puff Bars, which is a relatively newer brand, obviously has a much less regulation on it, which is why it has much greater levels of nicotine in the lungs than Juul. It essentially requires you to inhale more, which means that you're inhaling more nicotine, which is why we see that these Puff Bars are on net first, more addictive, and second, worse for your health, which is why we see that other e-cigarette alternatives, which people are most likely going to turn to and are turning to in the status quo, are only going to be on net worse. With that, let's go on to the negative case, which is that of the nicotine epidemic. The overview here is that zero tolerance has already been established by the FDA. The FDA has done a pretty good job at cracking down on the Juul's marketing strategies, which is why we see that it's so highly regulated in the status quo. It's done a couple of things. First, we see that Juul has already reached a huge settlement not to market to children. They've essentially banned all advertisements toward children, banning use of children in ads. They've banned the Juul from funding educational campaigns. Juul reached this huge settlement already because they were prosecuted federally and because of their actions in this regard. Yeah, question?
So aren't all those benefits you just claimed because of the FDA's ban on Juul? And doesn't that concede that the opposition world is better? Because you just said by banning Juul, all these marketing campaigns have stopped. So aren't you conceding that the opposition world is better?
No, because that was before the ban on Juul. The ban on Juul has been implemented very, very recently. Instead, we see that this settlement that they reached was actually a criminal court case that was implemented far before Juul was banned. It allowed Juul to continue operation on the condition that it did all of these things. And that is what Juul has done. Essentially, Juul has shut down marketing towards kids. And we see that this crackdown precedent has already been set by forcing Juul to agree to this huge settlement that is stopped all of their educational campaigns towards children, which means that all of their stuff about how it's being proactively marketed, it's causing a huge epidemic, is fundamentally flawed. We tell you that specifically, Juul is not allowed to market to children anymore. This precedent has already been set, and they aren't allowed to go into schools and pay people in order to advertise their use. Juul is only... because of this, we see that Juul is much more regulated in the status quo. Furthermore, we specifically isolate that Juul or e-cigarette usage has been going down in schools since 2019, which is far before the e-cigarette ban was placed, which is why we see that on net, the trend was already going down. People's addiction rates were not going up before Juul was banned, which indicates that this doesn't really impact anything. Their educational campaigns are failing. The epidemic of the status quo is not expanding. Instead, the real problem we need to address in today's world, where we're looking at things such as tobacco and nicotine, is what the best way to get people off these drugs is. And we tell you that specifically giving people access to better alternatives for tobacco is the only way we shut it down. Because kids in schools still use tobacco. There's a significant proportion. 90% of regular tobacco users have tried to have used tobacco before the age of 18, which illustrates that we see that critically, we need to offer alternatives to get people off tobacco before the epidemic grows. It's on a downward trend. Banning Juul is not going to help resolve the epidemic. Instead, it's only going to force a bunch of people to turn back to smoking, which on net hurts everyone. For all those reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative vote.
Okay, with that, I also have an 8-minute speech. If everyone's ready, I'm just going to give a quick off-time roadmap. It's just going to go their first contentions. We're going to go through some points that happened during my opponent's second speech, and then we're going to go through some logic chains, right? So if everyone's ready, my time, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. So let's start with their first contention, where they say that Juul is actually beneficial because it helps people quit. Now, this is flawed for a few reasons. First of all, we show you a bunch of studies where it shows you that Juul, even though it helps people quit smoking, makes them use e-cigarettes. Just because they're not addicted to cigarettes doesn't mean that they aren't addicted to anything. They're still addicted to e-cigs. And like my partner said in his first speech, after a year after quitting tobacco, most vapors were still using e-cigarettes, while fewer than 1 in 10 smokers who quit with the help of nicotine replacement therapy were still using it. This means that nicotine replacement therapy is working. That means even though my opponents say that it's expensive, even though it's expensive, it helps people quit. And that's the ultimate goal. It's the net good. Over the values that my opponents have set, which is the net good has to be better than the net bad, I would argue that having people not addicted to anything is better than having them addicted to e-cigs. So their entire first contention, you can drop that because we show you through our one card that nicotine replacement therapy is effective. It's helping net gain. It's giving people a net good instead of having them addicted to Juul, which also is expensive because people are addicted to it. They're constantly buying Juuls. So if you really want to talk about the economic impacts of someone that's addicted, you have to focus on the fact that nicotine replacement therapy completely eliminates nicotine from people's lives, while Juuling still makes them buy cigarettes or e-cigarettes. Now, let's move on to some things that happened in my opponent's second speech. The main thing I want to highlight is that when my opponent was questioned after my partner asked about having many people still addicted to nicotine worse than having like people Juuling, my opponent said that Juul doesn't have a market anymore, and that's exactly our world. She said that because Juul doesn't have a market, people are turning to alternatives. But that's the exact point that we're making. We are eliminating Juul's market. That's our entire first contention about how Juul's marketing is so terrible that it's making people addicted, and that she's literally agreeing with us. Yeah, sure, I'll take a question.
Given that, like, Juul's marketing approach was ceased before the ban on products, why was it necessary to ban products like after the marketing had like ended?
Yeah, so this is fantastic because I was just about to say this. So with your settlement piece where you say that Juul has reached a settlement, the settlement actually was reached after Juul was banned. Juul was banned in June of 2022, and the settlement was finally agreed on in September 6th of 2022. So with this, it basically shows you that the marketing was still happening. The marketing was still happening before that, which means that multiple kids were still getting addicted. Millions and millions of kids were seeing product advertisements, and that's really bad for a few reasons. Now, take our world, an alternative, where we show you that there's no marketing towards kids anymore. Kids are now safe from Juul. And because Juul is such an evil organization, I'm just going to give you a few more things that they did. First of all, they advertised on Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network, and they sent representatives not from a state body sanctioned group, but from their own company. And at the end of the day, Juul is a company focused on making profits, and they'll do whatever it takes to make profits because that's how a company works. Why is Juul mad that they're banned? Because they aren't making money, and that's what a company is supposed to do, make money. They don't really care about helping people because we've shown that nicotine replacement therapy is more effective than Juul. They don't care about that. All they care about is making profits, and marketing towards kids is their main target, and it's how they make their money. So let's look to their logic chains. Our opponents keep throwing statistics at you about how it's like 30% more effective, this. But when you really look at the logic, it boils down to our case beating theirs. If there's no marketing towards kids, there's no kids using Juuls. That's how it works. If there's no marketing, there's no opportunities for kids to get addicted, then they won't get addicted. That's just logic. You don't need statistics to back that up. And given that NPDL emphasizes a non-statistical debate, we win on that aspect. Now let's turn to what they do say about it. They do say when Juul is taken off the market, which is our goal, basically what agreeing with us, people switch to puff bars. And what I want to tell you is that puff bars, first of all, are less harmful than Juul, and second of all, don't advertise towards kids. So I'm just going to read something that basically says that there's neither puff bar or Juul is particularly worse. Juul has more nicotine than some vape liquids, and that's likely to make them more addictive. And that's really the problem here. The net harm is that people are getting addicted. So you're going to be voting for op for a few reasons now. First, there's a bigger net harm when you vote for AF because people are getting addicted to higher concentration nicotine products. And you're also going to be voting for neg because we tell you that when there's no marketing, there's no kids using vapes. That's logic. They can't refute that. They can throw all the statistics they want at you, but at the end of the day, if there's marketing, there's going to be an audience. Now, let's turn to our case because I do still have quite a bit of time. Let's turn to our case where we tell you that Juul is horrible. We tell you that Juul kills people, and we tell you that kids are addicted. Now, if this isn't the biggest net harm that you've seen, I don't know what is. Given that children are likely to experiment, like my opponent said, why is it not reasonable for them to start experimenting with Juuls, which are specifically advertised to them? By keeping Juul banned, we're preventing kids from getting addicted, and we're preventing them from getting hooked on and experimenting with nicotine products. And nicotine products eventually lead to addiction, and addiction is a net bad. So in their world, having Juul unbanned is a net bad in general. So you're going to be turning to us because we have a better case. Now, I want to go over this one point they said in the rebuttal that I forgot to about stigmatization of going to the doctor. What we've shown you is that our opponents have said that when they go to a doctor, there's a stigma around it, and then people don't want to do that. So having a Juul is like a quick and easy way to get out. But again, this point is refuted by having people still addicted to Juuls. Even though they're not smoking anymore, they're still addicted to Juuls. Whereas if you go to the doctor and you get nicotine replacement therapy, it's stopping your addiction forever. Yeah, I'll take a question.
So how long have these drugs been around? And based on that, like how many people have been able to get off smoking this?
I mean, I would argue that it doesn't matter because it's doing more than Juul is. Why are nicotine replacement therapies not banned and Juul is? It's because Juul is much more harmful. It's not about how many people they can get to quit smoking altogether. It's how many people they can help in general. So I agree. Juul does help people stop smoking, but it also gets them addicted to Juul. Whereas nicotine replacement theory gets them off smoking and gets them off nicotine in general. And that's the net benefit that we're looking towards. That's the net benefit that the neg gives you that the gov doesn't. And that's why you're going to be voting for us. We outweigh because we're showing you a better way out. We outweigh on probability because when there's still a Juul involved, there's still a chance for people to get addicted. And when there's still marketing, there's still a chance for kids to get addicted. And this is why you're voting for us, because we give you, in the words of the gov, a net good. We agree to their values, and we're showing you how we've given you a better chance at survival with this Juul. Now, let's finally end off with some of my case, or our case, where we tell you that Juul is horrible. Like, we've already illustrated that, first of all, it doesn't actually help you quit. And second of all, they market to kids. But I want to focus on a bit of our third contention, that Juul should be a last line of defense. The stigmatization around going to a doctor is roughly nothing compared to getting addicted to a Juul. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant in the equation because all it takes is just one visit to the doctor, whereas a Juul is a sort of like a 10-year commitment to an addiction, to spending money on a product that just ultimately hurts you. Now, when my opponents want to say that it helps people quit, we've already refuted that, and it doesn't matter. So what this is going to do is going to allow our third contention, where we tell you that Juul isn't effective, but other methods are, to slide through. This is going to go uncontested because it's a fact. It's logic. They can't disprove it. And for all of these reasons, you're going to be voting for op because we show you a better world that's already happening because we banned Juul. Thank you.
All right, I'm ready to give the opposition rebuttal speech of 4 minutes if everyone else is ready. Perfect. A quick off-time roadmap. In this speech, I'm basically going to go over what my partner just said and summarize all of the rebuttals to the government's case. And then I'm just going to do some weighing on the net harm versus net good value mechanism set forth by the government. So my time will begin now. First, I want to point out a flaw that my partner just brought up in his speech, but that deserves to go stated a second time. In that, when I was questioning the second opposition speaker, or the second government speaker, I talked about how when we ban Juul, then all of these marketing campaigns will stop because the millions of dollars Juul puts into marketing campaigns, they want to make funding because Juul is now bankrupt. And our opponents said that they reached a settlement deal to stop marketing before Juul was banned. And this is just a completely untrue statement by fact. My partner said the settlement to stop marketing was reached in September of 2022, while the ban of Juul was in June of 2022. So if anything, this just shows our opponents are conceding to our entire point that banning Juul stops marketing campaigns. Because anytime we brought up that a ban in Juul will stop this egregious marketing campaign, they just said, oh, look, it's already happening in the status quo. But it's happening in the status quo because of this ban, which is the opposition's world. Right now, we are living in the opposition's world. So anytime the opponent said that there's less marketing, that just goes to help our case. Now, I'd like to reiterate our first contention, which has flown through the entire round again, that it's not just about the banning of Juul and its impacts, but the statement it sends. When we ban Juul and its marketing techniques, all of the other companies which have less funding and less power than Juul, they will be, frankly, terrified to have their own marketing campaign targeted towards children because they see that Juul, a massive multi-million-dollar corporation, can go bankrupt because of the FDA's ban. So all these other alternatives, like Puff Bar, this directly goes into negating the government's contention too. They say that it exposes people to worse alternatives, but after this ban, Puff Bar is not going to send any more marketing because they're going to fear that they're going to go bankrupt just like Juul did. So, because of that, if Puff Bar has no marketing and Juul's marketing is already banned, this helps save future generations of children, as now no longer they're being preyed on by these money-hungry companies, but instead they don't have marketing to Juul, and it'll help stop the nicotine epidemic that's facing us. So yeah, quickly, that contention, our opposition contention flows through the whole round. Their contention, one, that it helps people quit smoking. We've rebutted that a lot of times. One, there are better drugs available. Two, that it's not confirmed to stop smoking by experts, as nicotine replacement therapy is much more effective. And three, Juul is constantly advertising new people to get on smoking. So if you get 10 people on smoking while only making one person help quit smoking, and not even quit smoking, just bring smoking down to vaping, this is 100% a net harm. So in the opposition's world, if we ban Juul altogether, not only will people stop using Juul as a method of quitting smoking, which is not effective, but it'll also stop these new 10 people from getting addicted in the first place. And finally, so that entire contention falls. Their contention too is that it exposes people to worse alternatives. We have two simple rebuttals. One, alternatives are not even actually better. Juul is worse than the alternatives. And two, that entire claim I just said about marketing earlier on. So now let's go over impacts that the government set forth. In this debate, we're talking about net harm versus net good. So I'm going to lay this out very simply. When Juul is banned, Number one, the nicotine epidemic stops. There's no more marketing towards children, and there's no more, and therefore children can't get access to Juul because Juul has gone bankrupt. So that's a huge net harm. It stops the entire underlying problem, the entire underlying societal issue that we're addressing in this resolution. And under the government's world, if we just let Juul keep going, we've seen what's happened in the status quo before the ban. Juul is just using awful marketing campaigns to help teens get addicted, and it's caused this entire nicotine epidemic that we're fighting so hard to get rid of right now. So obviously net harm versus net good, the opposition world has so much more net good, and for these reasons, simply negate. Thank you.
All right. Hi, Judge. Just a reminder that I'm Maya Young, and I'll be giving the final speech for the AF. Just a quick off-time roadmap. I'll be giving an overview on why we're winning, talking about the neg, the AF, and then doing a little two-world analysis. But yeah, I'll explain everything and which arguments I'm talking about as I go. So with that, I have 5 minutes. Is anyone not ready? Okay. My time starts now. Judge, the neg paints you this lovely world where as soon as Juul goes away, nobody's going to smoke. Nobody gets addicted and everything is going to be fine and dandy. But as much as I'd love for nobody to use nicotine, this is simply not the world we live in. Regardless of brand, people are continuing to consume nicotine. Despite the fact that Juul has been banned, puff bar usage has gone up 1,000%. The team you're voting for today should be the team that ensures people turn to the safest form of nicotine consumption, which, as we'll argue, is going to be Juul usage for a couple of reasons. Starting with the neg's main argument in today's debate is that Juul is bad because of its marketing. That banning Juul overall is going to solve everything because their marketing campaign was the root cause of teen nicotine use. But there are two responses here. One is that marketing is not the root cause of nicotine addiction. We tell you firstly that tobacco addiction was at high levels before the introduction of Juul overall, that people were already getting addicted to nicotine, were already smoking, were already using actual other forms of cigarettes. And furthermore, we see that even after the ban of Juul products, we still see that nicotine usage is still prevalent, specifically that teens using e-cigarettes is highly prevalent, that it's still on the rise despite the fact that Juul is banned because there are alternatives like puff bars, like cigarettes, like other forms of nicotine consumption. Despite puff bars not marketing to youth, despite FDA educational programs, we still see people using nicotine, and banning Juul doesn't solve. But secondly, even if you buy that marketing is the root cause, this is a point in our favor. Because in both worlds, with the ban on products or without the ban on products, there is still a ban on marketing. The ban on marketing is independent from the ban on products. Marketing and products are two different things, which means the settlement on the marketing approach is going to solve for the entirety of the next arguments. Because banning Juul products is only going to take away a critical method for teens and adults to transition away from worse forms of nicotine consumption. Because again, in the AF world, even if there wasn't, or in a world without the ban, even if there wasn't a ban on products, there would still be that ban on marketing. Juul still wouldn't be able to market to children, but they would still be able to sell products to people who wanted to use it to, again, transition away from smoking. Which leads me to the affirmative arguments. The first issue is that of quitting, and how Juul is a key way for smokers to quit smoking and nicotine consumption. We tell you that the neg's proposed alternatives simply do not work for two reasons. One is the issue of the statistical evidence. Again, sure, like statistics should hold the same weight as logical arguments. We're totally fine with that. But again, this is one reason why we tell you that e-cigarettes are twice as effective for helping quit smoking. We also give you logical reasoning. We tell you that the stigma, as well as the high prices of the prescription drugs they talk about, mean that if we with a ban on Juul, people aren't going to use these drugs. People aren't going to quit smoking because Juul was the one accessible way that they could quit smoking. Juul products are the only solution to help substitute for help people quit nicotine consumption. Our arguments that my partner tells you that nicotine usage was on the decline before the ban because Juul was helping people transition away from smoking and nicotine overall. Our second contention is about the issue of alternatives and how the alternatives are worse. And this is a really important voting issue here, Judge, because the neg concedes that with this Juul ban, teens are just going to turn to puff bars and normal cigarettes, both of which are far worse because they have higher nicotine levels and are less regulated. Which means even if you buy that the ban prevents kids from just getting addicted to Juul, instead they're going to get addicted to something worse. Which means again, the marketing campaign thing marketing doesn't solve, because we tell you kids, again, are using puff bars right now, even though puff bars don't have a marketing campaign. The fact of the matter is people are going to smoke regardless of whether or not it's marketed to them or not, which means ultimately we need to find the safest way to get safest method of nicotine for people who are already going to be using it in the first place. So let's talk about the two different worlds, a world with the ban and a world without this ban on products. In a world with a ban on Juul products, what happens? People are still addicted to cigarettes because they don't have an accessible way of transitioning away. We see that kids are still getting addicted to puff bars instead of Juul, that kids are still getting addicted to nicotine, are still becoming smokers, and are still seeing harmful health impacts. On the other hand, in a world without the ban, we see that Juul isn't going to be marketed to kids because, again, the settlement on marketing is independent of the ban on products. We see that the FDA still sets their zero tolerance policy because, again, the FDA is still going to be heavily regulating the market. They're still heavily regulating Juul and other companies. Again, marketing is not the issue. Tobacco addiction was at high levels before the introduction of Juul. We're going to see that people will have an accessible, affordable, and less stigmatized way to quit smoking. And ultimately, we're going to see that teens have a safer way to consume nicotine than they would in the world with the ban. Because yes, Judge, in an ideal world, nobody would be smoking. But fundamentally, this is not an ideal world. Because people are going to consume nicotine regardless of whether it's Juul, because the ban ultimately endangers children, endangers smokers, and endangers public health at large, I strongly urge a vote for the affirmation.
Good round, guys.
Yeah, good round, you guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Okay, I'll need about 10 or 15 minutes to make a decision. Do you want feedback? Do you want me to come back in the room and give that to you?
Yeah, I would appreciate that.
Everyone?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. Then look for me back here in about 10 or 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Green Brown, guys.
Hello, I'm ready to give some feedback. Hi. Is everyone ready? You don't have to turn on your cameras. I just want to know it's okay to start. Give it just a couple more minutes, though. It looks like we... Okay. All right. So we're good. You guys are together? Okay. All right. Okay, this was a really tough decision. You guys both did a great job. Really, really good arguments on both sides, and it was really a tough call for me. But I would have to say I decided to go with government on this one. I was persuaded in net by your arguments, and I'll just explain my reasoning a little bit more. Okay, so on the first point that having Juul available in the market reduces smoking, I was persuaded by this option, though there are opposition made some arguments about existing treatments. I think the wide availability of Juul and the proven reduction in smoking that results from that was established. I think on the point that alternatives to Juul that are available are worse than having Juul on the market, I didn't quite buy this one, so I gave that point to opposition. I think you both made some arguments, but neither one was entirely persuasive. I also sided with government on the effect of the marketing ban making prospective marketing of Juul irrelevant. I did buy that argument. And and I think on the last major issue, the zero tolerance message made by opposition, the effect that would have on future companies that might try to market drugs and addictive substances to kids. Though I did buy that argument, and I don't think it was effectively addressed by government. So I would give that point to opposition. However, I decided with government because while this zero tolerance message could have an effect in the future, the reduction in smoking would definitely, of having Juul available, would definitely happen. So I felt that you made a case that there would be net benefits for having the ban on Juul revoked. But you both sides did a great job, and it was a really difficult decision. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. All right. Bye. Thanks. Yeah, good luck to you all.